never believed in the old stories. You know, the ones that get passed down through generations, twisted and embellished until they're nothing but tall tales to frighten children. But now, as I sit here, staring at the gnarled old oak outside my window, I realize how foolish I was. It all started last summer, during one of those relentless heat waves that make the air feel thick and suffocating. The sky had been clear all day, not a cloud in sight, but the air was heavy with a tension I couldn't quite place. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. A low rumble in the distance sent a shiver down my spine, even though the sun was still blazing. The locals had always talked about the lightning tree. It was an ancient oak, twisted and blackened by countless strikes over the years. They said it was cursed, that anyone who stood beneath its branches during a storm would be taken. I dismissed it as superstitious nonsense until that night. The storm rolled in faster than I'd expected. One minute the sky was clear, and the next it was as dark as midnight. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the first drops of rain splattered against my window. I remember thinking that it was just another summer storm, nothing unusual. But as the thunder grew louder, a strange sense of dread settled over me. I was alone in the house. My husband was away on a business trip, and I decided to spend the evening reading by the fireplace. But as the storm intensified, I found myself drawn to the window, compelled to watch the lightning as it danced across the sky. That's when I saw it. The old oak was swaying violently in the wind, its branches thrashing like the arms of some monstrous creature. And then, in a flash of blinding light, I saw the figure. It was only for a split second, but it was enough to make my heart stop. A tall, shadowy silhouette stood beneath the tree, its eyes glowing with a pale, sickly light. I froze, unable to look away. Another flash of lightning illuminated the figure, and I could see it more clearly now. It was draped in tattered, rain-soaked clothing, its face obscured by shadows. But the eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, were fixed on me. I felt a cold hand grip my heart as the figure raised an arm and pointed directly at my window. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I must be imagining things, I told myself. It was just a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The stories, the warnings, they all came flooding back to me, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was in danger. The thunder crashed again, louder this time, and the lights flickered. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The storm had cut me off from the outside world, leaving me alone with whatever was lurking outside. The wind howled louder, and the rain battered against the windows, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the oak tree. The figure was still there, standing motionless beneath the branches. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, seeping into the house like a cold, damp fog. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away from the tree. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I stepped outside, I was soaked to the bone. The storm was in full fury now, the wind nearly knocking me off my feet. I glanced back at the oak, and to my horror, the figure was gone. The tree stood alone, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I jumped into my car and sped down the driveway, the tires skidding on the wet gravel. As I drove away, I dared to look in the rearview mirror. The old oak was barely visible through the sheets of rain, but I could have sworn I saw those glowing eyes watching me, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. The storm had passed, leaving only a light drizzle in its wake, but I knew I would never be able to forget what I'd seen. The next day, I learned that the old oak had been struck by lightning during the storm, splitting it clean in two. They say that the tree was cursed, that it finally met its end after claiming one last victim. I don't know if that's true, but I haven't been back to find out, and I never will. When I was a kid, thunderstorms terrified me. The rumble of thunder, the flash of lightning. It all felt like the world was tearing itself apart. My parents used to tell me there was nothing to be afraid of, that the storm would pass and everything would be fine. But I always knew they were wrong. I was 9 years old when it happened, the storm that changed everything. We were visiting my grandparents' old farmhouse in the countryside. It was a creaky, drafty place that always smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. I hated going there, but my parents insisted on these visits, saying it was good for me to spend time with family. That night, the sky had turned an ominous shade of green, the kind that makes you feel like something bad is coming. The air was thick and still, with not even a whisper of wind to break the tension. I remember standing in the living room, staring out the window, watching as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm hit with a ferocity I'd never experienced before. Lightning flashed across the sky in jagged lines, and the thunder was so loud it rattled the windows. My parents were in the kitchen, talking in hushed tones, while my grandparents sat in their armchairs staring at nothing. They seemed different that night, quieter, more solemn. I tried to ignore it, but a creeping unease settled into my bones. I was about to retreat to my room when I heard it, a soft, barely audible tapping coming from somewhere in the house. It was strange, rhythmic, like the sound of fingers drumming on wood. At first, I thought it was the rain, but the pattern was too deliberate, too purposeful. "Do you hear that?" I asked, but no one responded. My parents were too absorbed in their conversation, and my grandparents seemed lost in their own world. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to me, drawing me in. I crept through the house, following the sound. It led me to the attic door, a place I'd been forbidden to go. My grandparents always said the attic was dangerous, that it was filled with old, unstable junk that could come crashing down at any moment. But the tapping was coming from behind that door, and I was too curious to turn back. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a cold draft brush against my skin. I should have turned around, gone back downstairs, but something compelled me to keep going. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The tapping was louder now, echoing through the attic like a heartbeat. When I reached the top, I saw it, an old wooden rocking chair, slowly swaying back and forth, its legs tapping against the floor. But the chair wasn't empty. A figure sat in the chair, its back to me. It was tall and thin, dressed in tattered, moth-eaten clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. Long, matted hair hung down its back, and its hands, pale and bony, rested on the armrests. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure continued to rock, the tapping of the chair matching the rhythm of my racing heart. And then, slowly, it turned its head. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes, cold, hollow, and empty, like black holes that seemed to suck the light from the room. The figure stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its gaze piercing through me, filling me with a terror I'd never known. Then it spoke. "Come closer." Its voice was a whisper, dry and raspy, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. I shook my head, trying to will my feet to move, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "Come closer." The command was stronger this time, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward the chair. I stumbled forward, my body moving against my will. The air around me grew colder, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The figure leaned forward, its hand outstretched. "Closer." I was inches away now, my breath hitching in my throat. The The figure's hand reached out, cold fingers brushing against my skin. I let out a choked cry, and in that moment, the lights flickered, and the figure vanished. I was alone in the attic, the rocking chair still swaying gently. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the distant rumble of thunder. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the door behind me, and never spoke of what I'd seen. To this day, I can still hear the tapping when the storms come, and I know that somewhere, in the darkness, it's waiting for me to return. Growing up in the Midwest, I was used to thunderstorms. They were a regular part of life, sometimes thrilling, sometimes terrifying, but always something to be respected. My dad used to say that storms had a way of revealing the truth, of stripping away the layers we hide behind. I never understood what he meant until that night. It was late August, and the air was thick with the promise of rain, the kind of night where the humidity clings to your skin and makes it hard to breathe. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky darken, feeling that familiar electric charge in the air. My parents were inside, arguing again. Their voices had become the background noise of my life, something I'd learned to tune out, but something about that night felt different, heavier. The argument was more intense, more vicious, and I could hear my mother's voice breaking, something that rarely happened. I wanted to escape, to disappear into the night, but the storm was coming, and I knew I couldn't outrun it. The first flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a deep, rumbling growl of thunder that vibrated through my bones. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down my spine. I stood up, ready to head inside when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of our yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out to him, to ask what he was doing on our property, but the words caught in my throat. The storm was closing in, and I could feel the pressure building in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Another flash of lightning, and I saw him more clearly. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a history book, and his skin was pale, almost gray. He didn't move, didn't flinch as the wind whipped around him. He just stood there, staring. A crack of thunder split the air, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I turned to go inside, but something held me back. A feeling. A compulsion. I looked back at the figure, and this time he raised a hand, beckoning me to come closer. I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but I was rooted to the spot. The storm was almost on top of us now, the wind howling through the trees, the rain coming down in sheets. But I couldn't look away from him. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. As he came closer, I could see his face. Sharp features, deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. There was something ancient about him, something that didn't belong in this world. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking me to the bone, but I barely felt it. The man stopped at the foot of the porch steps, and for the first time, I heard his voice. "Are you afraid of the storm?" he asked, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. I shook my head, though it wasn't true. I was terrified, but not of the storm. I was afraid of him, of the way he looked at me, like he could see right through me. "There's nothing to fear," he said, taking another step closer. "The storm is just a part of the world like you and me." He was on the porch now, just a few feet away. I could see the rain running off his hat, dripping onto the wooden planks. His eyes were locked on mine, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Storms reveal the truth," he continued, his voice growing softer, almost hypnotic. "They strip away the lies, the masks we wear, and show us who we really are." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my body numb. The storm was raging all around us now, the wind screaming in my ears, the lightning flashing in quick succession. He reached out a hand and I recoiled, instinct taking over. But instead of grabbing me, he pointed toward the house. I followed his gaze and saw the light in the living room flicker and go out. Then I heard it. A scream, sharp and desperate, coming from inside the house. My mother's scream. I ran to the door, throwing it open, and was hit by a wave of cold air that took my breath away. The living room was dark, the furniture cast in deep shadows. My parents were standing in the middle of the room, facing each other. My mother was crying, her hands covering her face, while my father stood frozen, his expression unreadable. And there, in the middle of the room, was the figure. The same man who had been on the porch, now standing between my parents, his presence impossible to ignore. He didn't say a word, just looked from my mother to my father, as if waiting for something. The storm outside was deafening now, the house shaking with each crack of thunder. But inside, everything was eerily still, the only sound my mother's sobs. Then, without warning, the man turned and walked toward the door. He passed me without a glance, stepping out into the storm. I followed him to the porch, but he was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. The storm ended as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an uneasy silence. My parents never spoke about what happened that night, but things were different after that. The argument stopped, replaced by a cold distance that was even worse. I still see him sometimes, the storm watcher, standing at the edge of my yard whenever a storm rolls in. He never comes closer, never speaks, but I know he's waiting. For what, I don't know. But I do know one thing. Storms reveal the truth, and the truth is something you can't ever escape. There's something about the smell of rain on asphalt that always takes me back to that night. I was 17, stubborn, and thought I knew everything. My parents were out of town, so I had the house to myself, and I planned on making the most of it. But the storm had other plans. It started as a typical summer evening, warm, humid, with a sky full of ominous clouds. My friends had come over earlier, but they left when the first rumble of thunder shook the windows. By the time they were gone, the storm was in full swing. I should have been happy to have the house to myself, but something about the storm felt off. The lights flickered as I sat on the couch, staring out the window. The wind howled, and the trees in the backyard bent and swayed like they were caught in a dance with something unseen. I had grown up with thunderstorms, but this one felt different, almost alive. Then the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, leaving only the flashes of lightning to light up the room. I grabbed my phone to turn on the flashlight, but the battery was dead. Typical. I was about to go find some candles when I noticed something outside, a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was hard to see through the sheets of rain, but the person looked like they were just standing there, facing the house. At first, I thought it was one of my friends messing with me, but as I squinted through the darkness, I realized this person was different. They weren't moving, just standing there in the middle of the road, staring straight at me. A crack of thunder startled me, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease that was creeping into my mind. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a wild animal, the rain pounding against the windows. I decided to go upstairs to my room, hoping to wait out the storm in the relative safety of my bed. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. Who would be out in a storm like this? The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I crept back down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to go back upstairs and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the storm. At first, I didn't see anything, just the rain-soaked yard and the darkened street beyond. But then I looked down, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a man standing on the porch, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He was drenched, water streaming down his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Can I help you?" I managed to stammer, though every instinct was screaming at me to slam the door. The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly as if considering me. Then, slowly, he raised a hand and pointed down the road, toward the old path that led into the woods. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraping against metal. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "This place, it's not safe in the storm. You need to leave." My mind was racing. Who was this man, and why was he telling me to leave my own home? The storm was raging outside, but something about his words made me feel like I should listen. I glanced down the road, toward the darkened path he was pointing to, but I couldn't see anything through the rain. "Why should I go there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man's eyes seemed to darken, and he lowered his hand. "There's something coming, something that doesn't belong here. If you stay, it will find you." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. I stood there, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The darkness outside felt thicker, more oppressive. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for the storm to pass. But the man's warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Something was out there, something I couldn't see, and I had to get away. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and ran out into the storm. The rain was cold, stinging my skin as I sprinted down the driveway. I didn't stop to think, didn't look back at the house. All I knew was that I had to get away, to follow the darkened path, wherever it led. As I reached the edge of the woods, I glanced back one last time. Through the rain, I could see something moving in the shadows, something tall and dark, with glowing eyes that watched my every move. I turned and ran into the woods, the storm swallowing me whole. Thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel.